Hi friends. Tonight, I invite you to slip into a softer world. Not because it was kinder, but because time has blurred its edges like fog rolling over cobblestone streets. We are heading back, gently, to the alleys and ovens of Victorian England, where the scent of bread did not always signal comfort, and where being a baker, despite all romantic imagination, was often more curse than craft. In this tale, we shall walk beside Thomas Everley, a humble baker in the smoky heart of 1850s, London. Through 20 soft-footed chapters, we'll follow him from the twilight of each working day to the grey dawn that awaited, when the embers in his ovens never quite cooled and the flour in his lungs never fully cleared. So, pull the covers a little closer, rest your thoughts upon the pillow, and let me guide you into a world of hearth and hardship, where bread was survival and survival. Well, survival was exhausting. The morning did not greet Thomas Everley so much as it tolerated him. It was not the kind of morning you'd paint on porcelain or write about in poems. It was the colour of dishwater, and it smelled of soot and coal, like most mornings in Clerkenwell, a part of London that never truly slept, only simmered. The bell above his shop's crooked door had not chimed yet. It wouldn't. Not for hours, for the baker's day began in the sort of darkness that seemed almost deliberate, as though the heavens themselves conspired to keep his trade in shadow. The first movement of his day was a cough, always a cough, dry and choking, one that never quite loosened its grip. Flour dust, you see, clung to the lungs like grief to the heart. It coated everything, his boots, his eyelids, the floorboards of the cellar he called a bedroom, and by the time the church bells dared speak of morning, Thomas would already be halfway through his day. His small shop was built into a row of terraced buildings, its facade like a face too long in the rain. The sign above, Everley and Sons, had not been accurate for some years. There were no sons. There had been once. But time, like the ovens, was unkind and offered no apology. He lit the great oven with practiced ritual, stacking coke, a harder, dirtier cousin of coal, into the iron belly of the beast. The heat came slowly at first, and then all at once. No thermometer guided him, only the feel of the air, the way it licked the skin of his arms. Scalded knuckles were as common to him as a priest's calloused knees. In these first hours, Thomas became a silent machine of dough and rhythm. His hands moved in ways even he didn't fully understand anymore. Flour, salt, yeast, water, simple things, holy things. And yet, they held his life captive. Every loaf, every roll, was both a lifeline and a leash. His was not the artistry of a Parisian pâtissier. There were no sugared violets, no confections shaped like swans, just bread, brown bread, hard bread. Bread for navvies and dockhands, for laundry girls and tenement mothers. Bread that needed to last a week, sometimes longer. Bread that mustn't crumble in the coal scuttle or disintegrate when soaked in broth. Thomas often marvelled at how bread, something so essential, earned him so little regard. The butcher had admirers. The blacksmith, respect. But a baker was merely expected to exist, like rain or fog. Necessary, invisible, and so very easily taken for granted. The sweat began early, slicking his brow before the first rooster crowed in the next street over. The air grew dense. He opened the back door for relief, only to let in the reek of tanneries and chamber pots. There was no winning, only withstanding. Sometimes he imagined he could hear the bread singing, a faint crackle, a hiss, as the crusts split and curled in the heat. It was the one song that never bored him, and yet it made him sad, like lullabies sung by mothers too tired to mean them. At the heart of it all was the oven, the great iron furnace that ruled his life. It had a hunger all its own. It devoured time, sleep, and wood. It cared not for the baker's aching joints or failing eyes. If it was not fed and stoked, the bread would fail. And if the bread failed, well, customers were not forgiving. By the time the sun finally breached the horizon, His hands were already sore, red, cracked, burned. There were no gloves, no protections. Bakers learned to suffer early, and they learned it deeply. Breakfast, if it came, was little more than crusts. Perhaps a cup of tea, made from leaves used once already, but often it was nothing at all. Hunger did not wait until a baker had finished, feeding others. And then the doorbell would finally chime, breaking the early silence like a church bell on a battlefield. Customers came in quiet waves, maids sent by mistresses, boys in soot-stained caps, and sometimes, if luck smiled, a policeman who tipped his hat in gratitude. But mostly they came not with smiles but with expectation. Bread should be ready. It should always be ready. No one asked how he slept, or if he slept. No one asked about the cough. That's just what bakers did, wasn't it? And still, Thomas persisted. Not out of love. Not anymore. But because bread, despite everything, was the only thing he knew. And the oven, for all its cruelty, was the only thing that still listened to him. If you were to pass Thomas Everleigh on a foggy London morning, you might not look twice. His shoulders rounded from years of leaning into his labour, his hands wrapped in cloth that never stayed clean, his face pale with a dusting of flour that never quite disappeared. But beneath his apron and beneath his skin lived a fatigue deeper than the Thames and older than the soot on the rooftops. That apron, which he tied in the half-dark every morning, had once been white. Now it bore the hues of toil. Brown from the dough, grey from the ash, and pink from the occasional trace of blood. It was no garment of pride. It was a badge of endurance, of quiet survival. Few understood just how brutal the life of a Victorian baker truly was. For most, bread was the most ordinary of staples, taken for granted, expected to be fresh and available. But behind that crusty roll or dense loaf stood a man like Thomas, whose body had become the very price of daily bread. Let us begin with the heat. Not the gentle kind that warms the bones in winter, but a relentless, smothering presence that wrapped around Thomas like a second skin. The great coke-fired oven that dominated his bakery was a beast that never fully slept. It glowed from within like some fiery altar, demanding fuel and sacrifice in equal measure. The small brick room where he worked became an oven in itself. There was no such thing as breathable air, only a stifling stew of smoke, sweat, and steam. Even in December, he worked in soaked linen. By midday, the sweat would have soaked through the shoulders of his shirt and down the small of his back. In the summer, the bakery grew unbearable. He learned to ignore the way his shirt clung to his body, the way his boots squelched with moisture from the floor. He simply endured. Bakers always did. And then there was the dust, so constant it had become part of his breath. Flour, when still and bagged, seemed so harmless. But once loosed into the air by a careless scoop or the slap of dough on wood, it became something insidious. It coated everything. It filled the lungs and lined the throat. Thomas had long since developed the persistent cough that all bakers eventually acquired, a dry, wheezing echo that lived deep in his chest and flared every time he leaned into a sack of flour. They called it baker's lung, though the term offered little comfort. There was no cure, no salve, just the quiet realization that every breath carried the job further into your ribs. Some days, Thomas would wake in a panic, unable to fill his lungs properly, his fingers tingling from lack of air. But the loaves would not bake themselves, so he coughed and carried on. His hands were another matter entirely. No one who has not shaped thousands of loaves could understand the toll it takes on the skin. Dough is not gentle. It resists. It bites back. The salt that gives bread flavour also sucks the moisture from the baker's fingers. By the end of each week, the skin on Thomas's hands was cracked and raw, dotted with small cuts where flour and yeast had seeped in to sting. Sometimes, the yeast would inflame the skin into red, angry welts. He tried wrapping his hands in cloth or greasing them with animal fat, but neither held for long. The work was too constant, his fingers too vital. The burns were worse. Reaching into the oven with an iron paddle was an art form, but even masters slip. The heat did not forgive. Blisters formed, broke, and healed unevenly, leaving shiny patches of skin that looked almost melted. His back and legs fared no better. He lifted flour sacks, weighing more than 50 pounds, hoisted trays of bread at awkward angles, crouched to clean ash from beneath the oven, and stood, always stood, on stone floors that punished the feet. No cushion softened the ache. By age 45, he walked with a limp most days, a quiet dragging step that made children glance up from the street and whisper behind their hands. And sleep. Sleep was the most elusive comfort of all. Bakers kept hours no clergyman would envy. To have bread ready by sunrise, Thomas had to begin work long before midnight. The schedule left no room for regular rest. He dozed in fits, slumped on a stool, between batches, or propped up by sacks of barley in the back. His dreams, when they came, were brief and anxious. Loaves burning, customers yelling, the fire going cold. The exhaustion was not just physical, it was emotional. The pressure to never fail, never sell a burnt crust or an underbaked loaf, hung over him like a cathedral bell. In an age when hunger was a fact of life, bread was more than food. It was hope, currency, even medicine. 2. Fail was to betray not only his trade, but his entire neighbourhood. And yet, despite all this, there was no glory in what Thomas did. The butcher had drama, the blacksmith had sparks, the carpenter had craft, but the baker had crumbs and saws and silence. Customers didn't see him as a craftsman. He was simply the man who stood behind the counter, covered in flour, handing over warm loaves without a smile, because smiling hurt the jaw and Thomas was far too tired. Still, every evening, he untied the apron with hands that barely functioned. He folded it slowly, shook off what flour he could, and placed it over the back of a chair. And then he lay down in the small cellar room behind the shop, his bones aching, his breath wheezing, his arms trembling, and waited for sleep to take him before the oven called once more. This then was the toll beneath the apron, a lifetime traded for loaves. There is a particular stillness that falls over a city in the hours just before dawn, a hush so complete it seems as though the cobblestones themselves are holding their breath. But within that silence, in a bakery tucked between a shuttered pawnbroker and a crooked stairwell, there was motion, heat, and the scent of yeast rising into the shadows. Thomas Everleigh's nights were never truly still. For a Victorian baker, midnight was not an hour of rest, but one of reckoning. At the stroke of 12, while most Londoners curled beneath thin quilts and soot-streaked dreams, Thomas stood over his workbench, flour painting his sleeves, and, hands deep in dough that resisted with every need. His eyes, red-rimmed from smoke and lack of sleep, watched the dough rise like tides. Timing was everything. Miss the moment, and the bread would turn heavy, bitter, lifeless. But it wasn't only the dough that stirred at this ghostly hour. The customers came too, quietly at first, like cats slipping through alleyways. Some knocked on the back door, others tapped at the shuttered front window. And Thomas, used to the rhythm, never flinched. He knew their faces. He knew their stories. There was old Mrs. Harwick, who came wrapped in a black shawl far too thin for the season. Her son, she once said, worked the night shift at the docks. He needs bread for the morning, she whispered, always whispering, as if the darkness could hear and judge her. Thomas gave her 2 loaves for the price of 1, though she never noticed, or perhaps she did, and her silence was her thanks. Then there was Elias Farrow, a night watchman, who walked with a lantern and a pronounced limp. He liked his bread with extra crust, said it reminded him of his mother's baking before she went blind. Elias always paid in copper, carefully counted and polished. Sometimes, when the mood struck, he would linger and speak of the odd things he saw on his route. A pale man standing still in an alley, a cat that climbed chimneys, shadows that didn't move when they should. Thomas listened, though he never responded much. His hands were too busy shaping loaves and guiding them into the oven's glowing maw. But Elias didn't mind. He said the baker's silence was better company than most men's words. And then came Marigold, a name she likely invented. A girl of no more than 16, dressed in someone else's clothes. Her fingers trembled when she reached for the bread, and she never met Thomas's eyes. He did not ask what she did during the day, or why her visits always ended with her clutching the loaf to her chest like a secret. In her presence, the air seemed colder. He gave her bread without charge. She never thanked him aloud, but once, just once, he found a pressed flower beneath his doorstep the next morning. The bakery had become a strange sort of sanctuary for the sleepless, a place where the flames never died, and the door, if not open, was never truly closed. The people who came during these hours were not the respectable folk seen in Sunday pews or afternoon markets. They were the overlooked, the odd, the ones who lived in the spaces between normal hours. Some were kind, some were strange, a few were desperate. There were nights when men reeking of gin would pound on the shutters, their breath fogging the glass. They shouted for bread, not because they hungered, but because they wanted to remind the world they were still here. Once, a man tried to pay with a dead pigeon, claiming it was fresh enough. Thomas, unfazed, declined with a soft shake of the head. The man cursed him and staggered off into the mist. And yet, Thomas never considered closing his doors. Not really. To a man who lived by the oven's cycle, these nocturnal visits were simply another part of life. The hours blurred until he no longer distinguished between night and morning. Only the sky told him when the day had turned. And even then, the London fog often played tricks. He began to recognize patterns in the customers. A certain church bell would toll, and Mrs. Harwick would arrive. A distant cart would rumble past, and Elias would appear. Even Marigold came like clockwork on Thursdays, as if drawn by some invisible pull. There was, however, one customer he never grew used to. A man in a long coat and stovepipe hat, face obscured by scarf and shadow. He came every few weeks, never speaking, always placing 2 coins, larger than standard, on the counter. He would take a single loaf of unsliced bread, nod, and vanish into the night. His hands, Thomas noticed, were clean. Too clean. No soot, no calluses. A man who did not labour. Yet there was hunger in the way he gripped the bread, a desperation, just beneath the surface. Thomas wondered what kind of hunger it was. Odd hours breed odd habits, and perhaps odder truths. In the stillest moments, when the customers had left and the dough had risen, Thomas would stand at the back doorway, the warmth of the bakery behind him, and look into the empty street. The fog moved like breath across the stones, and the silence was so deep he could hear the crackling crust of the first loaf cooling on the rack. He rarely spoke, not even to himself, but sometimes he imagined the city breathing around him, its pulse felt in chimney smoke and carriage wheels, its voice heard in the soft knock of a tired hand seeking bread. It was a lonely trade, yes, but not entirely loveless. Because even in these forgotten hours, people still came. They came for bread, for warmth, for proof that someone was awake. Someone was working. Someone, like Thomas Everleigh, was still tending the fire, and in return, he received no thanks, no glory, only the chance to keep going. There are few things more comforting than the scent of freshly baked bread. To the passerby, it might evoke memories of family suppers, of hearths and homes, of warmth after rain. But for a Victorian baker like Thomas Everleigh, the fire behind, that fragrance was not merely comforting, it was terrifying. The oven was both a blessing and a beast. It gave life to bread, and in the same breath threatened to consume everything he had. In the heart of his bakery stood the fire-brick oven, a monstrous, soot-blackened cavity fed by coke and kindling, designed not for safety, but for endurance. Victorian bakers did not have the luxury of modern temperature controls or safety valves. Their ovens were built into the very bones of the building, nestled between timber walls and thatched thwarts. They burned for hours, sometimes days, their heat radiating through every beam and floorboard. Thomas knew his oven better than he knew most people. He knew when it growled with hunger, when it slept too cool, and when it whispered threats. The iron mouth of it had nearly taken his eyebrows more than once. Lighting it was always a ritual of risk. He would crouch low, feed in the coke with gloved hands, strike the match with a prayer, and then wait for the low roar that meant the fire had caught. But the fire did not always behave. There were times when the flames leapt too high, licking at the flue and the brick archway like a drunken choir. The soot that lined the chimney, accumulated from weeks of baking, could catch in an instant. One spark, just one, and the oven would become a furnace, with no conscience. Thomas remembered a summer, some 10 years back, when the bakery 2 streets over went up in flame. A baker named Lindley, newly widowed and slow in his movements, had failed to scrape the chimney. It was a mistake many made and most paid for. The fire had started in the oven, climbed into the walls, and by morning, nothing remained but ash and twisted iron. They found Lindley's body near the back door, blackened but intact. He had been trying to get out with a basket of bread still in his arms. Ever since that day, Thomas had lived with a lingering dread. His oven was old, its bricks were cracked, the mortar crumbled more each season, and he patched it with what he could afford, sometimes nothing more than wet flour and hope. He swept the flue religiously, even when his joints screamed for rest, and still, he never slept soundly with the fire lit. Not truly. You see, Victorian buildings were not built with fire resistance in mind. Most were wooden framed, tightly packed, and filled with dry kindling in the form of furniture, curtains, and books. If one building caught flame, the whole street could follow. And the bakery, with its constant heat and smoke, was always one accident away from disaster. There were nights when Thomas would awaken from the briefest slumber, the image of fire seared behind his eyelids. He'd rush to the oven, heart pounding, certain he'd see orange light spilling through the cracks. But it was always still, always contained, until the night it wasn't. It happened on a Tuesday, just as summer turned to autumn. The air was damp, and the chimney, already stubborn, refused to draw. Thomas had poked and prodded, fed it carefully, and finally coaxed it into life. The loaves had risen well, and he'd just pulled a tray from the heat when he heard the crack. It was not the crack of bread splitting, it was something deeper, a timber giving way. He turned and saw the thin line of smoke creeping from the base of the rear wall. It was not smoke from the oven. It was darker, meaner, filled with malice. In a heartbeat, he realized what had happened. The heat had slipped beyond the bricks into the wall itself. There was no time for panic. He grabbed a bucket, then another, hurling water at the smoke. But water alone could not fight a fire already hidden behind plaster and lath. He ran outside and rang the bell, calling for the watchman, for the neighbours, for anyone awake. Elias Farrow was the first to arrive, dragging a wet coat and a rusted axe. Together, they tore at the wall, coughing and cursing. Others joined. Boys, with pails, women with cloths. The flames had not yet taken hold, but the smell of danger was thick. By dawn, the fire was gone, quelled, choked, banished for now. But the wall bore a black wound, a warning that would never quite heal. The bakery survived. Barely. But Thomas did not light the oven for 2 days. He sat in the doorway, staring at the bricks, his hands trembling. For the first time in years, he wondered if it was worth it. This life of fire and flour, this constant brush with ruin. And yet, by the 3rd night, he stood once more before the oven, match in hand. Because bread must be baked. And in the world of a Victorian baker, the only thing more dangerous than fire was failure. If the fire was the soul of the bakery, then the scales were its conscience. To most who stepped through Thomas Everleigh's crooked door, a loaf of bread was a small thing, simple, cheap, taken for granted. But to the baker, every loaf was a careful act of balance between ingredients, between cost and labor, between feeding the poor and feeding himself, and always between trust and survival. The scales sat upon the counter like a judge in a worn court, brass plates polished smooth from decades of use, the weights kept in a leather pouch beneath. Every day, Thomas measured not just flour and yeast, but the very edge of what he could afford to give away. Victorian England was a place of harsh truths and harder coin. The average working-class family spent up to half their weekly income on bread alone. For the poor, it was not simply food, it was the center of every meal, the padding between hunger and despair. Yet bread, despite its necessity, was not cheap. To make flour prices fluctuated wildly, tied to harvests in distant counties or cargo ships delayed by storms. A bad season in Yorkshire could send the price of a loaf soaring in London. And when that happened, someone always paid, and it was rarely the wealthy. Thomas remembered one year, 1847, the year of short loaves, when the price of flour doubled in a fortnight. Riots broke out in parts of the East End. Men looted bakeries, not for gold, but for baps and brown loaves, desperate to fill their children's bellies. A neighbour of Thomas's, old Berridge, had refused to raise his prices. He was lauded in the papers for his honour, then quietly went bankrupt 2 months later. Thomas had learned from that. Now, he watched the scales with a careful eye and measured each loaf with precision. Too heavy, and he lost profit. Too light, and he risked legal trouble. Because in the peculiar laws of the time, bread was one of the most heavily regulated goods in Britain. The Bread Acts of the early century dictated not just weight, but even the shape of loaves sold to the public. Inspectors, called bread wardens, made rounds through the poorer wards, weighing loaves and checking shops for compliance. They came rarely, but when they did, they brought with them fines, closures, or worse, public shaming in local papers. Thomas had once seen a fellow baker hauled before the magistrate for selling a half-ounce light on a poverty loaf. The man pleaded that the dough had dried too quickly in the oven. The judge did not care. Justice, like bread, was measured in ounces. And then there was adulteration, the darkest shadow that hung over the baker's trade. It was an open secret that many bakers cut corners. The less honest among them mixed chalk, alum, or even plaster of Paris into their flour, whitening the bread and stretching their supply. Some added mashed potatoes, others sawdust. Anything to make a little go farther. To the eye, such bread appeared fresh, white, round, uniform, but to the stomach, it was a slow poison. Thomas, for all his faults, never adulterated his bread. Not because he was particularly noble, but because he could not bear the taste of betrayal. Bread, he believed, was too sacred a thing to foul. Still, the temptation was always there. When prices rose and customers demanded the same old cost, he would stare at the sack of flour and think, just briefly, what it might be like to stretch it. Just a handful of chalk, just a scoop of ground bone. No one would know, but he would know. Instead, Thomas adjusted his recipes. He made smaller loaves. He shifted to more brown bread, which used coarser, cheaper grains and carried the taste of iron. He offered poverty loaves to those who asked, drier, denser, often a day old, sold at half price. He wrapped them in cloth and handed them over, without a word. Sometimes the buyer was ashamed. Sometimes they were grateful. Sometimes they pretended they had simply made the wrong order and scurried out before anyone saw. One woman, thin as a broom handle, came every Thursday for the same misshapen loaf and left a button on the counter in place of coin. Thomas never called her out. By now, he had a small tin box beneath the shelf filled with buttons, pins, the occasional foreign coin, and once, a child's drawing of a sun with his name scrawled beneath. That box meant more to him than most bank notes, but charity had its limits. There were nights when Thomas would count the coin in his till and realise he couldn't afford fresh yeast for the week, or when he had to choose between a second sack of flour and coal for the oven. He made those decisions in silence, never speaking them aloud. To speak them would make them real. He once considered raising prices, even by a half farthing. He posted the new sheet beside the counter, plain lettering, neatly written. It lasted a single morning. By mid-afternoon, a woman had burst into tears when she saw the cost, her hands trembling as she held out a few silver coins. Thomas took the sheet down after she left and never put it back. There was no winning, only enduring. In the dance of coin and conscience, the baker was always the one who bowed last and lowest. To eat a slice of bread in Victorian London was, in truth, to take a gamble. For all its appearance of warmth and nourishment, the journey from flour sack to breakfast table was fraught with unseen perils. Behind the golden crusts and inviting aroma lay a world most would rather not know. A world of dust, damp, and things that scuttled when you weren't looking. Thomas Everley knew this world intimately. It was the very place he lived and worked. And he had long since stopped pretending. It was clean. His bakery, like most of the time, was built from necessity, not hygiene. The walls, patched with lime wash and cobbled stone, held in more than just heat. They harboured damp, rats, and the slow creep of mildew. In winter, water trickled down the walls when the oven wasn't blazing. In summer, flies swarmed the windows and stuck to the sticky spots of spilled treacle or fermenting dough. There was no plumbing, no fresh water from a tap. Instead, Thomas drew from a shared well 3 streets over, murky, iron-tasting, and sometimes tinged with a bitterness he dared not question. When cholera came, as it often did, people whispered about the water. They always whispered, but whispers couldn't boil the bread. Clean hands were a luxury for the idle. Thomas's were always covered in dough, soot, or a mix of both. He wiped them on his apron, rinsed them in buckets filled hours before. Sometimes the water would be cloudy before he'd even begun the day. But time waited for no man, and especially not for one selling bread by the hour. The flour, too, was not always what it seemed. Sacks came from the mill covered in dust and often stored in basements shared with coal or pickled fish. Rats found their way in more than once, leaving behind trails of droppings and little more. Thomas had grown adept at checking the top layer for signs of infestation, but he never had time to sift it all, nor could he afford to throw it away. He did what all the bakers did, skimmed, shook, and hoped. In the corners of the shop, cockroaches nested, small dark things that fled when the lantern light passed. He tried to trap them. He laid out sugar, mixed with arsenic, as advised by a tanner's widow who swore it cleared her pantry. But they always came back, as if drawn by the heat or the promise of yeast in the air, and still the bread must be baked. He swept the floor each evening, gathering a day's worth of crumbs, hair and ash, but the broom barely touched the corners. Beneath the counter, behind the oven, and under the flour sacks, there lay dust untouched by time. He dared not move them often. Once, he had shifted a sack and found a nest of spiders so thick it moved, like a puddle. He left it alone after that. The fermentation room, if one could call it that, was no more than a back cupboard where dough sat in bowls, rising in their own quiet breath. It was dark, warm, and damp. Mould grew on the walls, sometimes green, sometimes black. He wiped it when he had the energy. When he didn't, he turned the bowl and ignored it. It would not have mattered much, of course. Customers didn't ask where the bread rose. They only cared that it did. Once, a health inspector visited, an unscheduled call prompted by a local alderman's sudden concern for the poor. The man walked in with a notebook and a scowl, poked at the bread with a fork, and sniffed the air. He made notes on the walls, the floor, the state of the chimney. "You'll want to fix that backroom leak," he had said. "And those rats. Best find a cat that earns its keep." Then he folded his notebook, accepted a warm loaf from the rack, and walked out. Thomas never heard from him again. It was no secret that the city's sanitation was theatrical at best. The smell of open sewers drifted in from Clerkenwell Road, mixing with the sweeter scent of rising dough. Chamber pots were emptied from windows at dawn, splashing against the same cobbles where bread was delivered in wicker baskets. Cleanliness was a myth sold to the rich. The rest made do. Thomas had once read a leaflet from a missionary claiming that cleanliness is next to godliness. He had chuckled, not unkindly, and used the leaflet to start the oven fire. In his world, cleanliness was next to impossible. He often wondered how many people truly knew what they were eating. If they realized that the bread they tore apart at supper may have been rolled on a table scrubbed with yesterday's tea leaves, or mixed in a bowl where flour weevils danced unseen. And yet, despite it all, people kept coming. Every morning, the bell would chime and a line would form. Chimney sweeps, washerwomen, shoemakers, children clutching coins, men with hollow cheeks and stained collars. They didn't ask for clean bread. They asked for warm bread, and for bread that filled the belly more than the lungs. Because, as Thomas had learned long ago, hunger could forgive a great deal. And so he kept baking. Through mould, mites, and months when water ran foul. He wiped the table. He turned the dough. He fed the oven. And he placed each loaf upon the shelf with a quiet dignity that no dirt could tarnish. Because even in filth, even in ruin, bread, real bread, was still a kind of mercy. There are clocks, and then there are baker's clocks, those unwritten rhythms that do not tick and tock so much as rise and fall, like dough in a proving bowl. Time, for a baker like Thomas Everley, did not flow in hours and minutes, but in proofs and bakes, in feeds and fires. And it never, not once, waited. The day began in the night. Long before the first cry of a milk boy or the distant roll of market carts, Thomas rose in the quietest dark. There were no alarms, only the ache in his back, the sense in his bones that it was time, always time. He would light the lantern, his fingers stiff and cold, and shuffle across the stone floor in his stockings, careful not to wake the rats that skittered in the shadows. The match scraped, the wick flickered, and the bakery stirred, from its nightly hush, like some weary beast returning to life. The first task was always the oven. The heart of the bakery had to be fed and brought to temperature well before any bread could bake. Thomas would crouch before it, coaxing it into wakefulness with coal and dried wood, sometimes old newspapers, sometimes splinters from broken crates. The fire must be hot, very hot, and sustained. Not a burst, but a steady blaze. Then came the mixing. Flour, water, salt, and yeast. Simple ingredients, yes, but inexact. The flour was never quite the same from one sack to the next. The yeast was alive, temperamental. The water too warm could kill it, too cold, and the dough would lie sluggish, heavy. It was not so much baking as negotiation. A silent conversation with chemistry and chance. Thomas mixed by hand. There were no mixers, no machines, just two arms already sore from yesterday, plunging into bowls as wide as barrels, kneading and turning until the dough became something pliable, something promising. The muscles in his forearms swelled from years of this, taut and knotted like cords on a dockworker's winch. As the dough proved, rising gently in the back cupboard, near the warmth of the fire, Thomas would clean, wipe down the bench, sweep the floor again, though he knew it would never truly be clean. He would check the weights, refill the salt, oil the hinges on the oven's great iron door, and always, always, he watched the clock in his head. There was no rest, no hour in the day that truly belonged to him. When the loaves were ready, shaped, and dusted, they were slid into the oven with a long-handled paddle. The oven's mouth hissed in protest each time, its heat enough to blister skin in seconds. The bread baked fast in the old ovens, Too fast if he wasn't careful. A moment too long, and crusts blackened. Too soon, and the centers stayed wet and heavy. He learned over years to listen to the bread, to hear the crackling as it cooled, to smell the exact moment it was done, to feel the weight and know if it was right. Once the first batch was out, there was barely time to breathe. The shop door opened, and with it came the rush. Coalmen, washerwomen, and factory boys. Each one came with a coin, a nod, a request. 1 white, 2 browns, day old if you've got 'em. Something for the little one. He's not, well. Thomas served them all, moving between shelves and till, rarely speaking more than a word or two. Not out of rudeness, but simply because his mind was still counting. Still calculating the next mix, the next bake, the time until the oven cooled too far. And so the day stretched forward. When most were sitting to their midday meals, Thomas was baking the next batch. By afternoon, he was scrubbing tins, folding cloths, sweeping ash. He ate only if he remembered, usually scraps, ends of loaves too broken to sell, dipped in weak tea or yesterday's broth. Evening never brought rest. He used that time to prepare for the next morning, measured out flour, checked the firebox, mended tools if they'd splintered. Sometimes he washed his feet in a bucket by the back door, sitting on a crate with his sleeves rolled up, staring at the cracks in the ceiling as the light faded. Only, after dark did he dare lie down, and even then he did not undress fully. Just loosened his shirt, kicked off his boots, and lay upon a thin mattress stuffed with straw and old rags. His body, still warm from the oven's heat, would pulse with soreness. He did not always sleep. Often, he lay in a kind of twilight doze, the thoughts of dough and fire still whirling behind his eyes. He would wake at the slightest sound, fearing the fire had gone out, or the yeast had overproofed, or worse, that he had missed the time entirely. There were no days off. Sunday, the supposed day of rest, still held labour for a baker. The rich wanted their bread for after church. The poor came with pennies and prayers. And if Thomas dared close, the regulars would grumble, and some would simply walk to the next street over, to a baker less worn down by conscience. Vacations were stories told by others. Illness was something you baked through. Time off was for those who had someone else to stir the dough, and Thomas, alas, had only himself. He had no apprentice, couldn't afford one. No family left to step in, no wife to share the burden. Just him, the oven, the dough, and the endless ticking of a clock he could not see but always felt. It was not that he hated the rhythm, it was simply that he never escaped it. It is a peculiar thing, the way blame finds a baker. Bread, that most humble of staples, is expected to be perfect without fail. Golden crust, even crumb, soft within, sturdy without. It must not crack too wide, nor rise too high. It must taste rich, yet simple, and always fresh. But should the bread fall short, it is not the fault of the weather, the flour, or the fickle fire. No, the blame rests squarely upon the shoulders of the man who baked it. Thomas Everley had learned this hard lesson early. The first time a batch soured, he had been but 17, barely into his apprenticeship. He had misjudged the yeast, left the dough to prove too long, and when he baked it, the loaves emerged with sunken bellies and a bitter smell. His master, a stern Welshman named Crickley, had not shouted. He had simply thrown the batch into the alley for the rats and told Thomas to begin again. "No man will forgive bad bread," Crickley had said, wiping his hands on his apron. "They'll forget your name, but they'll remember your loaf." It was a truth that followed Thomas into his own shop years later, and so he measured each ingredient with care, proofed with an anxious eye, watched the crusts through the ovens, irons slit like a priest awaiting revelation. But perfection is a brittle thing in a world full of variables. There were days the flour arrived damp, heavy with hidden moisture, others when the yeast refused to rise, slumbering through the morning like a drunkard. Sometimes the fire burned too hot, blackening the undersides before the tops had browned. Other times, the loaves emerged with splits down their backs like wounds hastily stitched, and always someone would notice. "Bread's heavy today," a customer might mutter, turning the loaf in their hand with a disapproving squint. "This one's got a bitter taste," another would say, biting with suspicion. Or worst of all, "You're not using the good flour no more, are you?" He never answered back. To defend a flawed loaf was to defend a broken oath. He would nod, offer a new one at cost, and mark the loss in his head. Not on paper. He had long since stopped writing down such failures. It hurt less to carry them quietly. But there were greater disasters than burnt crusts and poor rises. There was the great saltless batch, a mismeasure on a sleepless night, when he had forgotten entirely to add the salt. The loaves baked pale and smooth, their smell sweet but strange. It wasn't until the first bite that the mistake became evident. Customers returned within the hour, some angry, others simply bemused. "Forgot the salt, did you?" One man laughed, holding up a chunk like evidence in court. Thomas had nodded, red-faced, and offered refunds. Most accepted. A few did not return, at all. One woman, old and proud, declared she'd take her coin elsewhere. And she did. Then there was the infested flour, a summer shipment filled with tiny beetles that had burrowed deep into the sacks. He'd not seen them until too late. Half a batch had gone out before he noticed the movement in the bin. He burned the rest, scrubbing every board, every bowl, until his hands bled. No customer reported illness, but the shame lingered like smoke and, worse still, were the accusations of dishonesty. Once, a woman had brought back a half-eaten loaf, claiming there were stones in it. Thomas examined the bread. Yes, it was coarse. Yes, the flour unrefined. But there were no stones. Only the harsh grind of budget grain. Still, she shouted. She accused him of cheating, of trying to stretch the flour with sand. A small crowd gathered. He could feel their eyes, their silent judgments. He offered her a replacement. She threw it on the floor. Afterward, Thomas swept up the crumbs with shaking hands. He did not speak for the rest of the day. It was not that he minded criticism. Not really. What gnawed at him was the way the bread was all they saw. Not the hours before dawn, the blistered palms, the cold water, the aching knees. Not the fire's bite or the flour's cough. Only the loaf. Only its shape and smell. In those moments, he did not feel like a craftsman. He felt like a suspect, and there were no courtrooms for bakers. Only the silent judgment of the market street. Some of his peers took to blaming the customer. "They don't know what bread ought to be," one man grumbled at the tavern. "Give 'em a good brown, and they spit it back like dirt. They want fluff, not food." Others blamed the flour, the water, the city. Thomas blamed no one. He simply began again. He rose each day with the same quiet determination, mixed the dough with sore arms, baked each loaf with care. And when a customer frowned, he did not argue. He listened, because he knew the truth. The loaf bore his name, even when his name went unspoken. There was something holy in bread, something sacred, and when it failed, it felt like a sin, but still, he baked. Even when they scowled, even when they doubted, because a baker could endure 1,000 blames, but he could not endure an empty oven. There are few professions as humble as baking, and yet in Victorian England, even the lowliest baker worked under the watchful gaze of the law. Thomas Everley had long grown used to it, the quiet knowledge that his loaves were not just judged by customers, but scrutinized by the Crown. They called them bread inspectors, though among bakers they were known less kindly, the bread police. Their purpose, supposedly noble, was to protect the public from fraud and hunger. But their presence was not always a comfort. To men like Thomas, their clipboards and weighted scales were not symbols of fairness, but of fear. You see, bread was not merely food in Victorian society. It was a commodity so essential, so interwoven with survival that the government had stepped in to regulate it tightly. Laws reached into every corner of the bakery: the size of a loaf, the shape of its crust, the price per ounce, the clarity of labeling. A loaf that deviated, too small, too light, too strangely shaped, was no longer just a disappointment, it was a violation. The rules came from the assize of bread, an ancient law revived and reshaped over the centuries. It dictated that bakers must sell loaves by weight, and that prices must shift with the cost of flour. It forbade adulteration, enforced fairness, and gave inspectors the right to enter shops unannounced. Thomas had seen it many times. The rattle of a carriage, a man in a coat too fine for the neighbourhood, a clipboard, a satchel, a set of polished brass weights. The bell above the door would chime, not with the softness of a customer, but with a sort of finality, the kind that made one's stomach twist. "Good morning, sir," the man would say, though his voice always held the clipped precision of someone who meant to uncover fault. "Your scales, if you please." Thomas would step aside. The inspector would weigh the loaves already on display, examine the crumb, test the density. He would measure the flour sacks in the back, ask about suppliers, check for signs of tampering, and he would record everything. Sometimes he'd ask about hygiene, though more often than not, the state of the walls or the presence of rats went unmentioned. The true concern was the bread. If it was too light, fines could be levied. If found adulterated, the baker could face public shame, even jail. Thomas had never been jailed, but he had come close. There had been an inspection 3 years back, when the flour he'd used had been laced, unknowingly, with alum by the supplier. Alum, a cheap chemical additive, made the bread appear whiter and softer than it ought. It was illegal, of course, but many millers used it to stretch their product. Thomas, desperate and short on funds, had taken a cheaper shipment that month, and the inspector had known. He tested the loaf, sniffed it, broke it open. Then he took out a small vial, added a few drops to a wet crumb. The colour turned violet, a sure sign. Thomas had watched, his face ashen. "You'll be reported," the man had said coldly. He had expected the fine, perhaps even the shuttering of the shop, but it never came. Whether the inspector pitied him or was simply too overworked to bother, Thomas never knew. But since that day, he never again bought cheap flour. He borrowed, he bartered, he went hungry himself, but he never risked the law again. Because to break the rules was not just to risk coin, it was to risk trust. The public, already suspicious, would turn on a baker who cheated them. News of a bad loaf spread faster than fire. A man could work 20 years in peace and lose everything with one accusation. People would whisper. Faces would disappear from the shopfront. The bell would fall silent, and the law did not forget. Every infraction was recorded. Repeat offenders were blacklisted, barred from buying from reputable mills, marked as untrustworthy in the eyes of the city. Some were even posted in broadsheets, their names listed alongside criminals and debtors. Thomas had seen such a list once, printed and pinned outside the local workhouse. He had scanned it for names he recognized and found too many. Good men, hard workers, undone not by villainy, but by poverty and poor luck. Still, the inspectors came. Still, the scales had to be true. And Thomas, despite the weight of it all, never dared leave his uncalibrated. He kept a set of test weights of his own, hidden beneath the till. Each morning, he would weigh his own loaves before placing them on the shelf. Each afternoon, he'd polish the brass, as if appeasing the gods of measurement. Not because he believed the law was just, but because he knew it was merciless. And in a trade where reputation meant everything, a few ounces could be the difference between survival and ruin. So he carried on. Balanced loaves on weary arms, balanced fear with duty, balanced honesty with desperation. Because in Victorian England, a baker did not just feed the hungry, He lived forever under the weight of the scale. In Victorian England, bread was not merely food. It was a quiet language of class. Its crusts whispered of poverty. Its crumbs carried the weight of wealth. And for bakers like Thomas Everley, who stood each day between the hearth and the counter, the contrast was unavoidable, baked into every loaf he sold. He served them all, the poor and the privileged, the weary and the well-fed, and each one revealed their station not just by coin, but by the kind of bread they requested. There was brown bread, coarse and thick, beloved by no one but tolerated by many. It was the bread of labourers, of widows, of children with ribs too close to their skin. It was cheaper to make, often using cheaper grain or ground barley, and Thomas kept it on the lowest shelf, not out of shame, but practicality. Those who bought brown bread didn't want to be seen buying it. They came quickly, eyes downcast, and left without lingering. Then there was white bread, soft, pale, made with refined flour. It cost more, looked cleaner, tasted lighter. The rich preferred it, or at least those who could afford to pretend they were rich. A loaf of white bread on the table was a statement. We are doing well. It was served in parlours with jam or in soup for the sick. The upper crust, as they were sometimes called, truly did eat from the upper crust of society's ovens. Thomas watched the divide daily. In the morning came the servants, collecting orders for the manor kitchens. They'd hand him a note, sometimes, sealed, listing precise quantities. 3 white loaves, unsliced, 2 fine rolls, 1 seed bun, if available. The servants were often polite, but distant. They had been trained not to linger in shops like his. Their masters would never darken his doorstep, not directly. They sent their hunger wrapped in ink and paper. Later came the labourers, the bootmakers, the coal porters, the washerwomen. They paid in copper, and sometimes, when times were bad, in barter, buttons, twine, a basket of eggs. They asked for day-olds, for the ends of loaves, for anything with more weight to it. They smiled when the bread was warm, thanked him when he slipped in something extra. Sometimes they came back just to say so. Then there were the in-betweens. The clerks with their ink-stained cuffs, the governesses, the shopkeepers' wives. They wanted white bread, but bought brown. Their coin could stretch only so far. They stood longer at the counter, hesitating, weighing the difference between pride and price. And Thomas, who had once dreamed of being seen as an artist of dough, found himself instead becoming a quiet arbiter of class, measuring not just loaves, but lives. He did not judge them. He could not, because he too was caught in the middle, too poor to dine on the bread he sold to the rich, too proud to live off the scraps he offered the poorest. He ate what was left at day's end, stale heels, torn crusts, the odd roll that had gone slightly hard. He softened them in broth or tea, pretending it was choice, not circumstance. He remembered once, a cold January morning. A little boy had come in barefoot, his hands blue, carrying a ragged coin in one palm. "Ma says we need bread, please. Any bread?" Thomas gave him a small loaf, still warm. The boy held it to his chest and smiled in a way that nearly unmade Thomas. The next morning, a lady in velvet entered, wrapped in a fox-trimmed coat. She ordered 6 white loaves. Spoke, as if the air was thinner where she stood. As she left, her heels clicking, Thomas saw the boy outside, still barefoot, watching her from across the street. It was in that moment he realized bread was the boundary, the line that marked who waited and who was waited on. He had customers who paid promptly and took offense if a loaf was imperfect, and others who apologized for coming in at all. He had seen men steal bread, not for greed, but shame, and women give up their supper so their children could eat. He once gave a crust to an old soldier who had come back from Crimea with half a leg and no pension. The man had eaten it slowly, with a reverence that stunned Thomas. "This," the soldier said, "is better than anything they fed us on the ships." There was no equality in the bakery, only proximity and quiet desperation. But Thomas, in his own way, tried to soften the edges. He made small rolls for the children, cheap, round, and sweetened slightly with molasses. He kept a hidden tin for those who couldn't pay, and when it emptied, he did not refill it with anger. He simply waited, trusted, knew that hunger makes good people do desperate things. Still, he could not change the structure. He could not afford to give more than a handful of extras. The books must balance, or the shop would close, and if he failed, there would be one less warm place on the street, one fewer hand to stretch a loaf just a little farther. So he baked for the rich and fed the poor, and stood between them like a bridge of dough and dust. Because in that narrow space where classes brushed shoulders, if only briefly, a baker was the last common ground. And bread, despite all the weight it carried, was the one thing both prince and pauper still reached. For with bare hands, there was a time when the title and sons meant something. It was carved into the wooden signs above shop doors, inked on flour sacks, passed down like an heirloom. Bakers' shops across England bore it proudly. Everley and Sons, Cromley and Son, Baker and Sons, as though tradition itself was baked into the name. But for Thomas Everley, the sign above his door had begun to feel like a ghost story. There were no sons, there were no apprentices, only ashes where the next generation should have been. Once, he had hoped. When he first opened the shop, Thomas had imagined teaching a boy to knead dough, to light the oven, to read the bread's soft language of rise and readiness. Perhaps a son, or a bright-eyed nephew, or a boy from the street with clever hands and a silent hunger. He would pass down the knowledge as his master had passed it to him, not with praise, but with practice. And in return, the boy would carry the fire onward when Thomas's hands grew too slow. But the world had other plans. The first boy he took on was Matthew, 12 years old, bones like reeds, eager as a puppy. He came from a family of weavers, poor but proud. For 3 months, Matthew worked beside Thomas. He swept, he fetched water, he watched the oven like it might whisper secrets. Thomas had begun to hope, quietly, carefully, that he might stay. Then, one morning, Matthew did not arrive. Later that week, his mother came, hat in hand, face pinched. "He's gone to the rope works," she said. "They pay a penny more, and he's the only one who can climb the ladders." Thomas did not argue. He simply nodded, and the door closed. The next apprentice was Arthur, 17 and strong as a cart horse. But Arthur had opinions, dreams of opening his own shop in Suffolk, of making sugared buns and almond cakes for fine ladies. "Bread's fine," he'd say, "but it's dull, innit?" Arthur lasted 6 weeks. After him came Peter, who burned his hand on the oven and never came back. And then there were none. Young men no longer wanted to be bakers, not truly. They wanted to be clerks, soldiers, machinists, chimney sweeps, anything but men who rose at midnight and fell asleep at supper. The world was moving, the railways were expanding, factories needed fingers, cities needed drivers, and baking, for all its history, had grown tired. The trade was too hard, too dirty, too dangerous. There were no unions for bakers, no protections, no future. Thomas could not promise a boy a better life, only an earlier death and arms that ached. Before 30, he could not offer wages that matched the docks or the factories, and even the romantic idea of owning one's own shop had faded. The big bakeries were coming, steam ovens, delivery carts, imported flour. Small shops like his would be swallowed, one by one. And so the next generation never came. The work grew heavier. There were days when Thomas could not lift the flour sack alone, when his knees gave out halfway through sweeping, when the fire felt hotter than usual or the smoke thicker. He worked slower, spoke less, counted each movement. There was no one to pass the paddle to, no one to teach how to hear the loaf crackle or test the oven's breath with the back of the hand. Sometimes, when the dough rose in silence, he spoke aloud, not to himself, but to the memory of what might have been. "This one's overproofed, lad. See the bubbles?" Or, "Flowers too wet today. Add a handful more, but gently." He imagined a voice answering back, a pair of hands beside his own. A laugh, perhaps, when the dough stuck. The imagined warmth of legacy. But the bakery remained, silent. He tried once more, in his 50s. A lad named Eli, orphaned and thin as a rail. He had spirit, sharp eyes, fast fingers. For a few months, Thomas thought perhaps this time, perhaps, but Eli stole coin from the till. Not much, a few pennies, likely for food or drink, or worse. When Thomas confronted him, the boy cried, said he was sorry, that he'd pay it back. Thomas gave him bread and told him to go. He did not take. On another, it wasn't just the labour, it was the loneliness. To teach was to hope, and hope, he had learned, was an expensive habit. Now, he moved through the bakery like the last character in a fading play. The tools hung where they always had. The paddle leaned against the wall. The flour sacks came and went. The oven still burned. But the silence was louder. Sometimes he stood in the shop and looked at the sign above, Everly and Sons. It mocked him. He considered taking it down once, but then he thought, what if someone came in? A child, curious. A young man, hungry for more than bread. What if one day the door opened and the next generation arrived at last? So he left the sign, as a wish, as a whisper, as a prayer baked into the walls, waiting for hands not yet born. In the eyes of the law, bread was property. A loaf, however humble, was the domain of its owner, guarded by coin, protected by statute. And to steal a loaf, even a crust, was not considered hunger, or despair, or survival. It was simply theft, and theft, in Victorian England, carried punishment. Thomas Everly had seen it with his own eyes. The first time, he had been no older than 20, sweeping the front of the shop in the early grey light, when he heard the shout. Across the street, a butcher's boy was chasing a child, small, barefoot, wild-eyed. Clutched in the child's hand was half a roll, torn and damp with sweat. The boy didn't make it far. A constable had been nearby and caught him easily. The roll fell to the street. No one picked it up. It sat there, trampled by boots, its value gone the moment it left the shelf unpaid. The child, no more than 7, was marched away in silence. "Bread thief," someone muttered, shaking their head. "Won't last long in the house." Thomas had not spoken, but something had shifted in him that day. The hunger of London's poor was not new to him. He had seen it in the eyes of customers, in the hollow cheeks of coal porters, in the pale skin of seamstresses. But there was something especially cruel in watching a starving child punished for reaching toward warmth. It wasn't long before it happened in his own shop. One cold December, just before the lanterns were lit for evening, a boy, 13 perhaps, slipped in while Thomas was kneading. He said nothing, moved quick, reached for the shelf, snatched a roll, and turned. But the bell above the door betrayed him. Thomas looked up just in time to see a blur of motion and the door swinging shut. He chased him, only to the alley. Only until the boy stopped, panting, bread still in hand. "Wait," Thomas had said. The boy stood still, chest heaving, eyes wide as coins. "Did you need it?" Thomas asked, stepping closer. The boy didn't answer, just stared. Thomas took a slow breath and nodded. "Then eat it. But come back tomorrow. I'll show you how to make one." The boy did not return, not that night, not ever, but Thomas never told the constable. Others were less kind. He'd heard of bakers who beat thieves with rolling pins, who held them by the collar until police arrived, who testified in court, sentencing boys and girls to the workhouse, or worse, the hulking prison, at Coldbath Fields. And the law, blind as it was, never asked why the bread was taken, only whether it had been paid for. In 1848, a woman was hanged for stealing a loaf and a shawl. The papers called it petty crime. The neighbours called it tragic. The law called it justice. For Thomas, the truth lay somewhere else, between pity and pragmatism. He couldn't afford to give bread to everyone. His books barely balanced. His own stomach was often half-fed. But when the thieves came, quiet, desperate, usually children, he didn't reach for the broom or the shout. He watched, he waited, and sometimes when no one was looking, he left an old loaf by the back door. He told himself it would have gone stale anyway. He knew the signs well, the eyes that lingered too long on the shelves, the small hands hovering near, the scuffed boots stepping in without purpose. Most thieves never looked him in the eye. They didn't want to take. They needed to. He'd known mothers who offered buttons, shoes, even rings for bread. Fathers who came in shaking with shame. Old men who asked for scraps, then walked away before he could answer. Once, a girl left a feather in place of coin. Another time, a boy returned 3 weeks later with a copper he'd found in the gutter. "These streets are hungry," Elias Farrow, the night watchman, once said as he leaned against Thomas's doorframe. "And they're watching the bakeries." Thomas had nodded. He understood, because the baker, whether he wished it or not, sat at a crossroads, between comfort and crime, between mercy and margin. Every loaf was a question, every crust a choice. There were days he wanted to lock the door, to bar the windows, to sell only by appointment. But those same days, he saw the mother wiping her nose on her sleeve as she handed him pennies, the dock boy eating slowly, savouring each bite, the cold, blackened hands clutching brown bread like treasure. And so he baked more than he needed. He marked some loaves, damaged when they were not. He gave the last rolls of the day to the laundry girl who never spoke. Not because he could afford to, but because he could not afford not to. In a world that beat children for hunger, where the bread was chained by price and law, Thomas did the only thing he could. He made just enough room for kindness. And in that tiny space, between crime and crust, he remained a baker, human flawed, but quietly, defiantly merciful. When the last customer left and the final coin dropped into the till, a strange quiet settled over Thomas Everleigh's bakery. Not peace exactly, but a truce. A pause in the long war of dough and fire, of weight and weariness. Evening did not bring rest, but it brought something slower, something softer, like the final notes of a hymn echoing through an empty nave. The soot lingered, as it always did. It clung to the walls, settled in the creases of his shirt, drifted in tiny clouds. With every step, the fire, though fading, still pulsed within the oven, its breath a dull orange glow. The smell of bread, fresh and fading, mingled with the older scent of ash and damp stone. This was Thomas's least favourite part of the day, not because of the labour, though there was plenty of that still to do, but because of the silence. In the early hours, there was motion, purpose, even the illusion of company. The oven hissed, the dough crackled, the bell above the door chimed, the world pressed in with its many needs. But at night, all that receded. The world fell away, and the bakery became a cave, a cloister, a kind of tomb. He moved slowly, carefully, in rhythms learned long ago. The trays were wiped, the wooden paddles oiled, the ash scooped out from the oven's belly and dumped into the bin by the back door. The broom swept not just crumbs, but the remnants of the day itself. Flour, thread, a single hair, a scrap of paper someone dropped. The floor creaked beneath him, boards warped by years of heat and footfall. The ceiling above bore smoke stains, in the corners, like old shadows that had tried to escape but failed. He hummed sometimes, not a tune exactly, just a low sound, barely audible. A way of marking the time, of proving to himself that he was still there. Outside, the city grew quieter. The clatter of wheels slowed. The laughter of drunks drifted like fog. Somewhere, a baby cried. Somewhere else, a church bell tolled, though Thomas had long stopped counting which hour it marked. He poured himself tea, lukewarm, bitter, brewed from leaves used twice before. He drank it in the doorway, one hand against the frame, staring out into the narrow alley behind the shop. The stars, when they showed themselves, looked smudged, fogged by the soot of chimneys and the soft exhale of tired lungs. The night carried its own music, the distant bark of a dog, the clop of a late horse, the rustle of rats in the gutter. Sometimes the whisper of someone passing by, too softly for words, just a breath, just a moment, and always the weight of aloneness. Not loneliness exactly, for Thomas had long made peace with his solitude, but aloneness, the recognition that he was the only one awake within those walls, the only heartbeat in a space built for many, for apprentices, for customers, for the children he never had. He would often sit on the stool beside the oven, palms open on his knees, eyes closed, letting the warmth soak into him, the last warmth of the day. It seeped into his bones like a lullaby. It smelled of scorched bread and old iron. He thought of his father sometimes, though he hadn't seen the man in 30 years, of his mother, who had taught him how to braid dough on Sundays, of friends who had moved on, died off, or simply stopped visiting. Their faces came in fragments, smiles without sound, hands reaching for loaves that no longer existed. The walls around him held the history of every loaf. If he pressed his palm to the wooden counter, he could feel it, the weight of hundreds, thousands of mornings. The quiet pride, the sharp failures, the nights of fire and cold, all of it, baked into the grain of the wood. Sometimes, he whispered aloud, just to hear something break the quiet. Well then, he'd say, to no one, that's another day done. He'd close the shutters, latch the door, and begin the slow climb to the small room above the shop. His legs ached by then, knees stiff as old hinges. He took the steps sideways when the pain flared too sharply. The room was plain, a cot, a chipped bowl, a window that stuck in summer. He undressed slowly, folding his clothes with the care of someone who owned few. He washed his hands in cold water and rubbed a cloth over his face, not to cleanse, but to remember the shape of himself. Then he would lie down. The bed creaked, the mattress sagged, his breath slowed, but sleep did not come easily. His mind retraced the day, the fire's mood, the feel of the dough, the faces of customers. He counted loaves in reverse. He listened to the oven cooling below, imagining its breath fading into embers, and always just before sleep he wondered, was it worth it? This life of flour and fire, of soot and silence. There were no answers in the dark, only the soft exhale of the city beyond his window, and the knowledge that in a few short hours he would rise again, that the oven would need feeding, that the scales would need setting, that the bell would chime and someone would ask for bread and he would give it, because that, in the end, was all he knew. And the silence, though deep, though vast, was the only place where he could still hear the truth of his trade. To fall ill in Victorian England was no small thing. It was not a pause, not a rest, not even an inconvenience. It was a threat to livelihood, to dignity, to one's very place in the world. For the poor and for tradesmen like Thomas Everley, illness was not measured by pain, but by consequence, and for bakers, the cost was especially high. There were no sick days, no relief shifts, no apprentices to step in. The dough did not wait, the fire did not pause, the mouths of the city did not cease their hunger, because a baker's breath had grown shallow or his joints stiff. Thomas had learned to work through much, aches, chills, coughs, but some ailments dug deeper, burned longer, hollowed him in places that dough and flour could not fill. He remembered the first true illness clearly. It came in the middle of winter. The cold had seeped into every crack of the shop and the oven, though it burned steadily, could not chase away the frost. His cough, which had been a mild presence for years, turned violent, deep, rattling, tearing, the kind that left him breathless, bent double, stars swimming in his vision. It was baker's asthma, they said, a thing so common it barely earned a name, caused by flour dust, by the damp, by the soot. But no cure was offered, only suggestions. Open a window, wet the floorboards, take walks. Walks. At 3 a.m, between kneading and baking, there was no time for walking. He carried on. He covered his mouth with a damp cloth for a while, but it grew sour with each breath. He took to drinking hot water with vinegar. It burned going down, but sometimes loosened the tightness in his chest. He kept a tin of mustard powder nearby and rubbed it on his ribs at night, an old remedy from a widowed neighbour who claimed it had saved her husband. And still, the coughing came, not every day, but often enough. Once, he collapsed at the bench. His vision narrowed, his knees buckled. When he came to, he was on the floor beside a spilled bowl of dough, the oven still yawning behind him. He lay there for nearly an hour before sitting up, palms shaking. No one came. There was no one to come. And so, he got up, baked the bread, served the customers. The illness never fully left. It grew into him like ivy, wrapping around his lungs, whispering at night. He learned to live smaller, spoke less, moved slower. He learned to gauge his days not by strength, but by endurance. And when his joints began to stiffen in the mornings, especially the knees and wrists, he added that to the list. Rheumatism, perhaps, or just years of standing on stone, lifting, flour sacks, scrubbing soot. There was no diagnosis. He simply carried it. The worst days were the ones with fever. He could feel them coming, the strange heat behind the eyes, the bone-deep ache that made even stirring dough feel like war. On those days, he'd lean against the oven for warmth not needed, sweating through his shirt as the fire blurred before him. Once, he baked an entire batch and didn't remember doing it, only realized when he saw the cooling rack filled and the bench still covered in flour. His fingers bore new burns he didn't recall receiving. And still, he worked, because the alternative was unthinkable. To close the shop, even for a day, meant word would spread. Customers might drift elsewhere, coin would stop flowing. The landlord, never a patient man, would demand rent regardless of fever or fracture. There was no system to catch men like him. If he fell alone. He knew of bakers who had died on the job. One man, old Crenshaw from Limehouse, had baked his last loaf while coughing blood. The customers noticed, reported it. He was gone within a week. The shop shuttered. The space turned into a fishmonger. No plaque, no tribute, just the faint smell of yeast that lingered in the floorboards. Thomas didn't fear death exactly. He feared disappearing. He feared the day someone else would light the oven and forget the man who'd stood there for decades, coughing flour into a cloth, kneading through pain, measuring out bread by hand and heart. He feared that all he had endured would be swept up in a final breath and vanish into the soot, and so he baked through illness. When his eyes swam, he blinked harder. When his knees gave out, he leaned. When the fire felt too hot, he stepped closer, daring it to burn the sickness away. Customers never knew. They didn't see the way his hands trembled under the counter, the way he sat behind the door between batches, head resting on his knees. They only saw the bread, warm, round, waiting. And that was all they wanted, all he could give. Still, sometimes, someone noticed. Once, a girl brought him a cloth soaked in lavender, said her grandmother used it for waking breath. Another time, Elias Farrow handed him a flask of something strong. Just once, the watchman had said, "Drink something for yourself." He did, just once. It burned, but it warmed too. These small kindnesses did not cure him, but they reminded him he was seen, that though the illness curled like smoke within him, he still cast a shadow. He still had shape. And as long as he could knead, shape and bake, even sick, even shaking, he would not disappear. Not yet. Not tonight. There are some losses that echo louder than bells. Others don't ring at all. They move through a man quietly, like smoke in the rafters, like a chill between floorboards. They do not wail or roar. They simply settle and stay. Thomas Everleighs. Grief was of the quieter kind. He had known loss before. He had lost coin, friends, tools, time. He had watched neighbours leave, watched apprentices vanish, but nothing had prepared him for the loss of her. Her name was Marion, though to Thomas she had always been more than a name. She was a sigh in the morning, a laugh at the counter, the soft rustle of linen in the shop when the fire was low. She was warmth, not the kind the oven gave, but the kind that lingered even when the coals went out. They met, as such things often happen, by chance. It had been an icy morning, and she had slipped outside the bakery steps. A fall, a startled cry, a tear in her glove. Thomas had come rushing out, flour on his sleeves, hands awkward as he helped her up. Her cheeks were red from the cold, and her voice was light. "I suppose that's what I get for admiring the sky instead of the street," she said with a laugh. He offered her a roll, not knowing what else to say. She returned the next day, and the next. Sometimes she bought bread. Sometimes she only lingered, asking about flour or fires or how he got the crust to crack just so. He found himself answering her questions with unusual patience, found himself watching the door more often. In time, she began to help, dusting shelves, wiping soot from windows, arranging loaves with an eye for charm. She brought in a pot of rosemary and placed it by the door. "For scent," she said, and indeed, it changed the place. Customers commented. Thomas stood a little taller. They married quietly. No grand ceremony. Just a few words spoken before dusk, a borrowed shawl, a small gathering. In the back of the shop, there was no feast, but there was bread, braided with care, touched with herbs, warm and shared. And for a time, the world felt more than enough. They shared their days like song verses. She swept while he baked. She hummed as she scrubbed. She made suggestions, smaller rolls, sweeter crusts, little signs to mark day-old bread. The shop bloomed in her presence. Even Elias the watchman said the air smelled brighter. She had a way of softening the space between things. She also spoke of someday. Someday they might take a small trip. Someday she might learn to bake herself. Someday, maybe a child. Someday was a word Thomas had begun to believe in. And then, like mist burned away by morning, she was gone. It began with a cough, then came fever, fatigue, a strange flush in her cheeks. At first, they thought it was simply the cold. She insisted on working. He insisted on rest. By the third day, she could no longer rise. A doctor came, distracted and distant, mumbling about lung fever. He left a bottle and a frown. She whispered his name through the night, hands hot as embers. By the week's end, she no longer spoke. He held her hand as she passed, not with drama, not with tears, just a long, slow exhale, like dough deflating. Thomas sat with her in silence, washed her face, brushed her hair, laid her favourite shawl over her chest. When they came to take her, he nodded, not trusting his voice, gave them the rosemary sprig from the door. Then he returned to the bench, lit the oven, mixed the dough, because the shop could not close, because bread still had to rise. The customers came, and he served them. They did not ask. Perhaps they didn't notice, or perhaps they respected the silence, the way some churches fall still without needing instruction. He moved like a ghost in his own body. The days lost shape, the dough blurred. Sometimes he burned loaves and did not care. Other times he stared at the fire too long, forgetting the hour. He slept little, ate less. The cot upstairs felt cold even when he kept his coat on. The rosemary plant wilted. He did not replace it. One evening, he found her thimble in the flour bin. How it had gotten there, he didn't know. He held it in his hand for a long time, then placed it in the drawer beneath the till. It stayed there, untouched, for years. Grief changed the bakery. He no longer rearranged loaves with charm, no longer polished the front window. The small sign she had painted, warm bread, kind hearts, faded until only a few letters remained. But he baked. He always baked, because grief, like dough, needs working, needs kneading, needs heat. And in the oven's glow, he found the one thing that still made sense. He began marking one loaf each morning with an M, a small cut near the base, barely noticeable. He never sold those loaves, kept them for himself, broke them slowly, piece by piece, each night. A quiet vigil, Elias noticed. "Still think of her?" he asked once, gently. "Every time the fire takes," Thomas replied. Years passed. The grief did not leave. It merely settled deeper, like flour between floorboards. It became part of him, part of the shop, part of the bread itself. Sometimes, a girl would enter who reminded him of her, or a laugh in the street would strike a long-dulled chord. He did not chase these memories away. He let them come, like the rise and fall of dough. He did not speak her name often, but he did not forget it. And in that silence, in the soft rhythm of loaves rising, her absence became a presence. A warmth not from fire, but memory. A baker lives by fire, not just by warmth, but by the constancy of it. The presence of flame as both master and companion. The oven, always alive, always hungry, is more than a tool. It is the sun in a baker's sky, the anchor of every day. Without it, the dough is just wet silence. And so when the fire failed, Thomas Everly felt something close to fear. It was a morning in early February, when the streets wore frost like lace, and even the smoke from chimneys hung low and heavy. He rose as always before the light. His breath came in clouds inside the bakery, and his hands ached from the cold even before they found the firewood. But when he crouched before the oven and struck the match, nothing happened. The kindling hissed, sputtered, and went dark. He tried, again and again. The match flared, then died. The chimney was clogged. He could smell it now. A thick, bitter staleness that meant soot had filled the flue. It happened sometimes in the worst weather. The cold compressed everything. The soot hardened. Air stopped moving. The oven became a tomb. He stood slowly, knees protesting. The loaves could not wait. The dough was ready. The orders were expected. And he, the only man in the shop, had no fire. In better times, he might have had help. A boy to climb the roof, to poke the flue from above, to shout down when the air finally cleared. But Thomas had only himself. And his limbs no longer took kindly to ladders. He fetched the rod from the back room, a long iron pole with a soot-blackened end. It was meant for stirring coals, but today it would serve another purpose. He climbed the narrow stairwell to the roof hatch, his breath loud in his ears. Outside, the sky was the colour of slate. The rooftop was slick with frost. The chimney stood like a sentry, puffing nothing, waiting. Thomas braced himself, leaning, close, and jammed the rod downward, twisting, forcing, praying. Soot spilled like old snow. A bird's nest tumbled out, half frozen. And then, finally, a gust of warm air surged upward, brushing his face. The oven could breathe again. He climbed down carefully, legs shaking. But the lost hour had cost him. The dough had overproofed, swollen too long. Some loaves collapsed when he tried to shape them. Others tore. He baked them anyway. There was no choice. The oven, though lit now, sulked. The fire didn't catch properly. It smoked, burned unevenly. The temperature danced wildly, too hot, then too cold. the crusts scorched before the centers baked. The scent of char filled the room. Customers noticed. A woman sniffed and frowned. Different today, isn't it? Thomas nodded, said nothing. He watched as the day's work unraveled. One by one, the loaves betrayed him. The bread he gave out was not his best, and it shamed him. But worse was the sense, rising deep inside, that he was losing the fire. It had always obeyed him, this oven. For decades, it had answered his touch, his timing. But now, it growled like an old dog, more bark than bite. It hesitated, complained, rebelled, and Thomas, too tired to argue, simply endured. That night, he sat by the embers long after the last loaf cooled. The fire hissed low. The soot on the bricks glimmered faintly. He pressed his palm to the oven's side. It was warm still, but barely. Not the deep, faithful heat he once knew. The oven was failing. Its bricks were cracking. Its flue sagged. The iron doors groaned each time he opened them. He had patched it many times. Mud, ash, even flour paste when he had nothing better. But some things, once broken, cannot be mended by hand alone, and he could not afford a new one. The cost was too great. The installation required time, tools, men, so he made do. He rose earlier to light the fire longer. He watched the flames more carefully. He adapted his dough to bake faster, but the stress carved deeper lines into his face. There were mornings when the oven refused entirely, when he sent customers away, cheeks red with apology. There were weeks when his profits shrank, when a missed batch meant missed meals. Elias noticed the change. "Time for a new furnace, old friend," he said one night, eyeing the smoke curling from the chimney. Thomas only shook his head. "I've built my life on this one," he whispered, because to replace the oven felt like burying a friend. It had warmed Marian's hands, baked her favourite bread. It had roasted the loaves marked for the poor, the rich, the hungry. It had been witness to grief, laughter, silence. It was a hearth in the truest sense, a place where memory lived. And now it wheezed like him. That winter, Thomas began baking, fewer loaves. Not from lack of flour, but because he could no longer trust the fire. He adjusted his shelves, explained to customers that there was a shortage. Most understood. Some did not. One woman sniffed, muttered about getting better bread. In Clerkenwell, she never returned. But the ones who remained, the regulars, the weary, the kind, said nothing. They took what he could offer. They smiled when he handed them bread, slightly misshapen. One boy even said it looked like a dragon's mouth. Thomas laughed for the first time in days. Still, he knew the truth. A baker without a reliable oven is like a sailor without a ship. He can still tie knots, still sing the sea songs, but he no longer sails, not truly. And so, each night, Thomas sat by the cooling oven, hands wrapped around a cracked mug, and waited. Waited for the day when the fire would fail entirely, and wondered if, when it did, he would finally sleep past dawn. For most of his life, Thomas Everly believed that bread and politics did not mix. A baker's duty, he thought, was to flour and fire, not ballots and banners. The oven knew no party. The dough rose regardless of who sat in Parliament, and the loaves he shaped did not care whether the man eating them wore a worker's cap or a silk cravat. But Victorian England had a way of dragging every man into its machinery, whether he wished it or not. Bread, simple, honest, daily bread, was never just bread. It was currency, it was protest, it was power. And soon enough, Thomas found himself caught in the rising heat of voices that echoed far beyond his oven walls. It began with whispers. In the pub down the street, men spoke in hushed tones over ale, of grain tariffs and price controls, of reformers and radicals. The corn laws, once repealed, had not ended the tension. Flour prices still rose and fell with the wind, and each time they did, the burden was felt most heavily in shops like Thomas's. He noticed the shift first in the coin. People came with less, asked for more. "Can't you cut it smaller?" they asked, holding out a farthing like it was gold. He saw the shame in their eyes, the quiet pleading behind each transaction. And then came the posters, pasted on alley walls, slapped over church notices, nailed to lampposts in the night. "Bread or blood," one read, in bold black strokes. Another, "Rise up while you still can eat." Thomas stared at them as he walked home one evening. Their edges curled in the wind like burning parchment. He said nothing, tore nothing down, but a part of him clenched. Soon, protests began, not in his street, not yet, but close. Clerkenwell, Islington, men with signs, women with children in arms. They marched not against kings or ministers, but against hunger, against the price of flour, against bakers sometimes, by name. One morning, a fellow baker, Henry Croft, came limping into Thomas's shop, a gash across his brow. "They smashed the window," he muttered. "Threw the loaves in the street, called me a thief." Thomas poured tea. Henry drank in silence. "I only raised the price by a halfpenny," he whispered. But in those days, a halfpenny could mean a missed meal, and a missed meal could mean a child buried by week's end. Thomas kept his prices steady, or tried to. He stretched dough thinner, added more barley, made smaller loaves and sold them for less. But it was a delicate game. Too little, and he would lose what little profit he scraped. Too much, and he'd join Henry in the ranks of profiteers. Once, a man stood outside his shop and shouted, "This one hoards the grain." Thomas opened the door, calm. "Come in," he said softly. "See the shelves." The man hesitated, looked, saw the modest stock, the soot-smudged counters, the worn tools. He said nothing more. But the memory stayed with Thomas for days. He never considered himself a political man. He had never voted, not because he didn't care, but because he was never allowed. Property laws and ownership requirements saw to that. A man like Thomas, despite his decades of labour, had no say in how his city or country was run. That, too, he accepted. Until one day, a young man in a flat cap entered his shop with a pamphlet in hand. "You should come," he said, placing it on the counter. "They're speaking at the square tonight, about men like you, about fair prices, about the right to be heard." Thomas looked down at the leaflet. The ink was fresh, the words bold, the People's Charter, for bread, for rights, for representation. He almost laughed, almost told the boy to save his fire for someone younger, but instead, he kept the pamphlet. Read it that night by candlelight, lips moving silently over each word. He did not attend the rally, but he began to understand something. He had never put to words. That bread, his bread, was not just food, it was evidence, a record of policy, a reflection of governance, a measure of whether those in power remembered the hands that fed the city. When the protests drew closer, he shut the front door and served customers through the back. He boarded the windows, not out of fear, but respect. Let the voices rise. Let them speak. He baked double that day, leaving warm loaves on the stoop after sunset, wrapped in brown paper. No name. No coin was ever offered, none expected. He watched as they vanished one by one, and though his hands were cracked and his back weary, he felt something almost forgotten. Pride, not in the trade itself, but in the quiet defiance of continuing to serve those who could not speak, loud enough to be heard. The next day, someone left a ribbon on his doorknob. Red, simple, no note. But Thomas understood. He never joined a party, never stood at a podium, never raised a fist. But his protest came in crusts, his ballot cast in brown bread and broken coins, and through the rising noise of a nation learning to listen, Thomas Everley remained at his bench, shaping dough, feeding fire, and baking a truth that no law could silence. In the hush of early morning, when the fog still pressed against the glass and the gas lamps had not yet faded, Thomas Everley would sometimes find himself staring not out the bakery's front window, but into it. The pane was old, its surface wavy and dim with age. It did not reflect clearly, rather, it shimmered with ghostly shapes. His own stooped figure, the outline of racks and loaves, the pale flicker of the oven's light. But lately, the window had begun to show less movement, less life. Fewer shadows bustling behind the counter or reaching for bread on the shelves. The world beyond the glass had changed, and with it, the ancient flour-dusted rhythm of the baker's trade had begun to slip quietly away. It wasn't a sudden decline. No, the fading came slowly, like embers dying in a grate. At first, it was only the customers. Where once he had queued families at dawn, their breaths puffing like kettle steam as they waited for brown loaves and warm buns, now there were gaps between, each ring of the bell. Faces he'd known for decades vanished, one by one. Some moved to newer districts, some passed away, some simply stopped coming. Then came the silence. The afternoons stretched longer. The bench where Marion had once sat untouched. The oven roared still, but the noise no longer echoed against full shelves or lively chatter. He baked fewer batches, made fewer rolls. Even the pigeons outside seemed less curious. He began to notice the competition. It wasn't like before, when rival bakers were just men like him, shoulder to shoulder in hardship. Now they were companies, with brass signage and delivery wagons, and glass cases that gleamed like jewelry shops. Their bread came uniform, perfectly shaped by machines. Their windows never fogged, their aprons never truly soiled, and they sold more than bread. Biscuits from Belgium, tea cakes, pies with sugared crusts. Baking with science, the signs said. Thomas had chuckled the first time he read that, but he wasn't laughing now. The customers that still came, those few faithful souls, often spoke of the newer shops. They slice it for you, one said. Even bag it in waxed paper. Another had brought him a loaf once, proud to show what modern baking could do. Thomas had looked at it, pale and puffy. It's soft, he'd said. The customer had nodded. And cheap. And that was the thing. It wasn't just the new methods, it was the price. Factories could undercut him at every turn. He could not match them, not with hand-mixed dough, not with coal-fired ovens, not with aching joints and days that began before sunrise. He tried. He adjusted his recipes, offered half loaves, lowered prices where he could. But it wasn't enough. The crowd was drawn to ease, not effort, to uniformity, not soul. Once, a child stepped inside, tugging her mother's sleeve. "It smells funny," she said. Thomas didn't take it personally. Children did not remember the scent of real yeast, of rising dough, of crusts blackened just slightly by hand. How could they? The bakery, to most now, looked outdated. A relic, its shelves worn, its corners dusty, its walls lined with soot and memory. He had considered painting the outside once, but he feared covering the history. Each smudge, each crack felt like part of the shop's voice. To whitewash it was to silence something he didn't quite know how to name. So he left it, preserved in its decline, preserved in its truth. Still, decline does not mean surrender. Thomas continued to bake. Not out of pride, but because he did not know how to not bake. The oven's light was the only sunrise he needed. His hands still remembered how to shape a loaf by feel alone. The weight of a finished bowl in his palms felt like a kind of communion. Each morning, he lit the fire. Each day, he filled the shelves, even if only halfway. Each night, he swept the flour from the floorboards. He did not pretend the trade was, as it once was, but neither did he abandon it, because in every loaf he still made, he left behind a whisper of what had been. The smell of real bread rising, the touch of a crust broken by hand, the soft sigh of an oven door swinging open. He saw it as witness work, to remember, to keep alive, to show, quietly, that the way of the old baker still had dignity, even in its dusk. Elias, the old night watchman, came by less often now. His cough had worsened, his walks shorter, but once a week, without fail, he'd rap on the back door and say, "Still standing, Tom?" And Thomas would nod. Still burning. They'd share a cup of weak tea, speak little, two men aging in a city that no longer needed what they offered, but who offered it still. One morning, Thomas watched the sun rise through the smoke-streaked glass of the bakery. The light caught dust in the air, turning it gold. For a moment, the shop looked not tired, but timeless. He touched the window. The glass was cold, but the oven behind him still glowed, and in that warmth, he found enough reason to keep the shadows, moving for one more morning, one more batch, one more loaf. There comes a moment, not marked by fanfare or bells, but by silence, when a craftsman knows he has reached the end of his road. For Thomas Everleigh, that moment arrived on a morning like any other. It was still dark when he opened his eyes. The chill crept beneath his blankets, and the air in the room held that familiar dampness of old stone and coal dust. He rose, as he had always done, wrapping his shawl around his shoulders, and felt the ache in his knees bloom like a slow bruise. The cot creaked beneath his weight, the same way it had for years. But something was different. There was no fire waiting in the oven, no bread proofing by the hearth, no scent of flour or yeast, just stillness. And in that stillness, he understood, not with his mind, but with the deeper knowing that lives in the bones and beneath the skin. This would be his last day. He did not say it aloud, did not write it down, but his hands, when they reached for the apron, stopped, hung still in the morning, gloom. And gently, instead, he reached for the tin of tea leaves. There would be no dough to shape today, no fire to stoke, no flour dust rising like fog. Only one final walk through the shop, through the memories it held, like fingerprints pressed into every board and bench. As the water boiled, he moved through the bakery in silence. He ran his hand along the edge of the old table where he had kneaded thousands of loaves. The wood was worn smooth, polished not by wax, but by years of labour and quiet reverence. He touched the window pane with his fingertips, remembering Marian's reflection, there once, wrapped in her shawl, placing a sprig of rosemary in a chipped pot. The kettle sang softly. A thin ribbon of steam curled upward, and he poured the tea with a careful hand. He drank it standing, not because there were no chairs, but because sitting felt too much like rest, and he wasn't quite ready to rest just yet. On the far shelf lay the ledger, its spine cracking, corners curled. He opened it slowly, each page a year, each line a memory, orders from neighbours now gone, tallies of flour purchased, notes in Marian's neat hand, 3 loaves for Mrs. Whitlow, paid in. Eggs. Do not forget Elias's birthday bun. These tiny scribbles were more dear to him than any gold coin. He turned the pages until he reached the last. It was blank. He closed the book and placed it gently beneath the counter. Outside, the city stirred. The clatter of early carts, the strike of hooves on stone. Voices called to one another in the fog, muffled and low. But none paused outside the bakery. The bell above the door stayed still. There would be no customers today, no crusts to wrap, no coins to count. Thomas stepped behind the counter and picked up the baker's peel, the long-handled wooden paddle he had used to pull loaves from the fire for over 4 decades. Its edge was chipped, its grain blackened by heat and time. He ran his hand along it one last time. Then, very gently, he placed it flat across the bench. He folded his apron, still dusted faintly with flour, and laid it beside the peel. He did not cry. Not because he wasn't sad, but because this ending had been earned, slow and steady, like a loaf that rises over hours, not minutes. This was not loss. It was closure. Upstairs, he packed a small bag, nothing more than a coat, a book of poetry Marion once loved, and a small jar of dried lavender. He took her shawl from the peg, wrapped it across his shoulders, and buttoned his coat over it. He looked around the little room that had been his world. It was no more than a cot, a wash basin, and a chair, but it had been enough. He descended the stairs for the last time. The oven sat cold. The racks stood empty. The shop breathed its old breath of yeast and coal and memory. He stepped to the front window and pulled down the curtain. It slipped quietly, as if in agreement. Then, with slow fingers, he took a small piece of paper and pinned it to the door. Closed. No explanation. No apology. Just the truth. He opened the door. The morning air met him like an old friend. Sharp, familiar, bracing. He stepped out, bag in hand, and turned the key in the lock. For a moment, he lingered, looking back at the wooden door, at the chipped stone step, at the little bakery that had held his whole life. And then, as the light grew stronger in the east, he walked away. He did not look back again, not because he did not love the place, but because he had given it all he had to give. And now, with his hands worn smooth by decades of kneading and his heart lightened by the knowledge that nothing had been wasted, he moved forward, not to begin again, but to rest, with the scent of bread behind him and the memory of fire still warm in his bones. Long after the last loaf had cooled, after the final ember in the oven had died, and after the sound of kneading had faded from the walls, the bakery on the corner of Clerkenwell remained, silent, still, but not forgotten. For though the trade had slipped into shadow, and though Thomas Everleigh had hung up his apron without applause or witness, the memory of bread endured, as it always does, in places unseen. The shop stood shuttered for years. Dust claimed the corners. The old sign above the door, Everleigh and Sons, grew faint, the lettering weathered into whispers. Children walked past without looking. The city, so restless in its growth, seemed to swallow the building like ivy over stone. But memory does not need light to survive, and inside, beneath the layers of time, the spirit of the place lingered like warmth long after a fire is out. People pass by without knowing why they slowed. They paused, not out of recognition, but because of something gentler, some pull of stillness, some hush that lived in the brick and mortar. A space once filled with early morning fire and the scent of rising dough had left behind a kind of echo, and echoes, too, are memory. In time, someone noticed. A young archivist from the borough office, sorting old maps, saw the name listed under a faded 1867 trade registry. T. Everleigh, baker. Curious, she walked the street, found the building, and stood outside its quiet face, hand resting on the cold wood of the door. She came back the next day, then the next. She asked about records, found none. Spoke to a local historian. They had heard rumours. A man who never married again after losing his wife, who baked even when sick, who never changed the way he worked, though the city changed around him. She was intrigued. In time, with gentle persuasion, the council agreed to open the space. They sent a carpenter, then a preservationist, and when they pulled the boards away, the scent of ash and thyme came out like breath. Inside, it was as though the bakery had only just been left. The work table stood untouched. The brick oven, blackened and noble, yawned beneath the soot. On one shelf, still folded, lay a baker's apron, yellowed, soft with age, and in a drawer beneath the counter, a small book, a ledger, not of profits, but of life. Dates, names, orders, notes in an old slanted hand. Extra crust for Mr. Davies. Leave before sunrise, Mrs. Finch can't sleep. No charge widow, lost husband in dock accident. Between pages, a dried flower. Lavender, still fragrant. The archivist wept when she read it, not loudly. but the way one does when they realize they have stumbled into someone's soul, perfectly preserved between flour and ink. It was decided, then. The bakery would be left as it was, not restored into gloss or repurposed as a cafe, but preserved in stillness, a space not for commerce, but for reflection, a quiet room with an open door, a place for memory. They placed a brass plaque beside the entrance, modest and plain. Here stood Thomas Everleigh's Bakery, 1845-1889. He rose before the city, baked, through fire and frost, fed the forgotten, and worked with hands that remembered what others chose to forget. This place honors him, and all labor done with care. People came, not crowds, but those who still believed in stories carved in wood and stone. They stepped lightly, spoke softly. They looked at the oven as if it might still hold heat. They touched the peel that leaned against the wall. They ran fingers along the shelves and read the ledger, tracing names now long gone. Some visitors were children, holding their grandmother's hands. Some were bakers themselves, eyes damp with quiet recognition, and always, someone left something behind, a drawing, a crust of bread, a single coin. Once, a boy no older than 7 placed a slice of fresh white bread on the counter and whispered, "This is for him." The curator, watching from the shadows, smiled, not because it was grand, but because it was true. And that was the thing. Thomas had never tried to be remembered. He had not chased fame or fortune. He had not left a family line, or writings, or great buildings. He had only risen early, shaped bread, and served those who came through his door. And yet, because of that, or perhaps in spite of it, he had become something more than memory. He had become meaning, a testament to the quiet dignity of simple work, of work done without applause, without fanfare, but with heart. A reminder that some hands shape more than dough. They shape the feeling of home. Years later, a poet visited. She sat by the cold oven and wrote a short verse, which was etched on a slate tile now fixed to the wall. He baked with ash, he baked with care, through frost and fire and thinning air, and though his loaves have turned to dust, we still remember, because we must. The bakery never sold bread again, but it gave something richer. It gave remembrance, not of a man, merely, but of a time, a craft, and a kind of love expressed in flour, sweat, and silence. And so, in the heart of a city always rushing, always growing, there remains a small space that does not, a room of ash and flour, where the fire has gone out but the warmth remains, where the last batch has cooled, but the story gently, endlessly rises.